Generous introduction. Thank you for those who are joining online tonight to learn something about critical race theory. This should be hopefully an interesting talk. I think I have a penchant for picking topics that I would sometimes rather not address due to their volatility. But at the same time, I think this is certainly something that is it's something that needs to be discussed. So I've done a lot of learning myself the last couple of weeks. I am hardly an expert on this topic, but my hope is that after this talk, you'll have at least a clearer idea of what some of the core claims are of critical race theory, what might be embraced, and what things ought we as Christians challenge. So I'm going to be relying on PowerPoint as I think this talk needs a lot of help, and PowerPoint will hopefully get us to a better place. From current slide, here we go. Thank you. There obviously has been no shortage of controversy around critical race theory over the last, especially 2 or 3 years. And a lot of these concerns have come from evangelicals in the church, and also related to school and education. And we're finding right now that we've got Christians on both sides of this debate. There are some Christians who are deeply troubled by critical race theory and claim that, I will refer to this hereafter or occasionally as CRT. There are many who claim that CRT actually incites racial tensions. The theory itself is actually centered around the belief that racism is deeply structural and embedded in our culture, more so than just merely a personal moral failure. We will look at that a little bit more closely later on. So the debates have been between legal scholars historically, state legislatures, media outlets, school boards, and now most recently the church, and including evangelicals. Some intellectuals support it, while others warn that CRT is effectively a dangerous ideology that threatens the church. Here's another alternative reading of the acronym, creating racial tension, with a man in the background checking Facebook on his phone or something. This is a recent heading. Well, it's actually 3 years old now. Don't let critical race theory infiltrate the church. This is from a Truth and Liberty website. But we also have professors in religion who say that critical race theory can be a tool in helping us understand exactly how religion operates in America. But perhaps closer to home and more narrowly among evangelicals, this debate has really exploded among Southern Baptists and the Southern Baptist Convention. Back in 2019, the Southern Baptist Convention actually passed a motion on critical race theory and intersectionality, a term we'll look at shortly too. They passed this motion as an attempt to occupy some type of middle ground between those who just uncritically accept it and those who think that it threatens the very existence of the church. And as usual, when you try to weave a path down the middle, no one's happy. But this is what they said back in 2019. This is their motion: that critical race theory and intersectionality should only be employed as analytical tools subordinate to Scripture, not as transcendent ideological frameworks. Be it further resolved that Southern Baptist churches and institutions repudiate the misuse of insights gained from critical race theory, intersectionality, and any other unbiblical ideologies that can emerge from their use when absolutized as a worldview. That seemed to be at least a fairly reasonable statement. But a few months after this resolution, a new group of pastors left the convention and founded the Conservative Baptist Network over concern that the SBC had capitulated to CRT. On the other hand, there were a group of 4 congregations in the Atlanta area, led in part by John Onwuchekwa, who were disappointed at what the SBC had said, and charged the SBC with failing to take racial issues seriously enough. Evangelical pastor John MacArthur was very unhappy with the level of skepticism expressed by the SBC in their resolution, and he offered a strong denouncement. The postmodern ideologies delivered from intersectionality, radical feminism, and critical race theory are consistent with biblical teaching. We further deny that competency to teach on any biblical issue comes from any qualification for spiritual people other than clear understanding and simple communication of what is revealed in Scripture. He also noted that the acceptance of CRT and intersectionality was a sign of liberalism taking over the church. And bear with me, we've seen that word intersectionality appear several times already without defining it, but we'll get there. On the other hand, this dispute is hardly a Baptist issue and reflects core disagreements among other evangelicals. So Dr. Vodi Bakum, he's a dean of theology at African Christian University in Lusaka, Zambia. He wrote a work entitled Fault Lines, the Social Justice Movement and Evangelicalism's Looming Catastrophe. He issued a short video here, which we're not actually going to play, but he concluded that CRT, while it may be a set of academic tools, it is also an evil ideology that threatens the welfare of the church. And then finally, these battles are also playing out in public schools. The Heritage Foundation is a research and educational institution devoted to the promotion of conservative values and public policy. I did watch a video that they had on their site, and I've summarized some of their stronger rhetoric here. They hold that critical race theory does not value people by the content of their character, nor does it value hard work. Unbelievably, critical race theory openly criticizes the civil rights movement, a movement that provided opportunities for millions of Blacks to find success in America. We can try to ignore the inconsistencies and idiocy of the flawed concepts of critical race theory. However, we do so at our peril. So this gives us just a little bit of the flavor of the nature of these debates as they're playing out in culture and in the church. So it's probably better to start at the beginning of critical race theory. How exactly did it begin? Which is an interesting question. And perhaps unsurprisingly, it finds its roots in the rise of critical theory, which may not be saying much. The next question is clearly what is critical theory? Critical theory refers to several generations of German philosophers and theorists who were operating in the largely Western European Marxist tradition that would come to be known as the Frankfurt School, beginning in the 1930s. Please, due to some of the extremely poor rhetoric being shared amongst Christians today, me tying the Frankfurt School to Marxist thought is not meant to be a conversation stopper, much less an outright condemnation of critical race theory. This is just merely a statement of the philosophies that were circulating at this time that inform unique understandings of culture and conflict and freedom. So yes, without a doubt, fundamentally, Karl Marx was behind some of these critical movements because he saw history as largely about class conflict. One of his giant philosophical predecessors by the name of Hegel asserted that ideas move history. Well, Marx believed that only economic and social structures do. At the end of the day, Marx believed that we are fundamentally workers more than we are thinkers, and that work should be rewarding and should be an end in itself. So the overarching concern for the Frankfurt School was this failure of the working class to see how wretched their conditions of labor were, and their failure to overthrow the powerful, their oppressors. So Marx and others viewed the ruling class, or the bourgeoisie, as the intellectual force that controls the material production and economic wealth. And they subject the working class or the proletariat in the process. I talk at greater length about this in a class I teach on Christianity in contemporary culture, which may or may not lead you to ever want to take that class. But part of the philosophy here is that the production of culture, that is in the terms of entertainment or other things to enjoy time, was part of deliberately keeping the oppressed happy so that they wouldn't stop and realize how unfair things were. So it's one of the founders of the Frankfurt School, Max Horkheimer, saw it. Any theory is critical to the extent that it seeks human emancipation from slavery or domination. A theory ought to have some type of force behind it, like a liberating influence. And it also, and I'm quoting him now, ought to create a world which satisfies the needs and powers of human beings. So yes, there are definite lines of Marxist thought in critical theory. We haven't talked about critical race theory yet, but we're getting there. But I also think it's important to note that Marxist thought is hardly today as dominant a theme as it was several generations ago. There is another generation of scholars in the Frankfurt School. I'm thinking of someone like Jürgen Habermas, who has argued that religion does indeed have a place in the public square, and that truth claims must be moral. Habermas is sharply critical of secularism, where God has been pushed out of the public square, and he is inviting religious voices back into the public square so long as they are able to take their religious claims and translate them into non-religious language. Whether or not you can actually do that is a huge question, and Christians will disagree vociferously over that. So more generally, a critical theory can be described as providing a descriptive and normative bases for social inquiry aimed at decreasing domination and increasing freedom in all their forms. Critical race theory operates within this strand of thinking. Descriptive means we're going to look at culture through a set of particular lenses, and normative implies that there is some sense in which, or some idea of the way the world ought to be. More recently, critical race theory has been influenced in the United States by critical legal scholars going back to the 1970s. I'm thinking of these names may not mean much to all of us, but I want to name them. Derek Bell, Alan Freeman, and Richard Delgado. They believed that by the 1970s, the gains that came through the civil rights era were starting to slow down, and that some of these sweeping statements by the Supreme Court were gradually being whittled away in lower courts. And so they held their first ever workshop on race theory at St. Benedict Center in Madison, Wisconsin in 1989. There they challenge the norms of neutrality in law. And they say that some of our laws are actually conceal a kind of structural racism that covertly support existing power relations, which namely means Caucasian or white individuals. So, okay, enough about the background. I will rely heavily on the third edition, Introduction to Critical Race Theory by Richard Delgado and Jean Stefanczyk. It's always, I believe, best to go to the sources and see what they have to say. And so we will be doing that this evening. And if you're interested in this topic, you are more than welcome to read this book. It's certainly not a long book, and there's so much material in there that I couldn't include in the interest of time and in the interest of interest. So I'm hope to give a fair assessment of what these scholars are arguing for, and then at the end to give some Christian reflections on this. Finally, after 15 minutes here or so, here is the definition they put forward in their book. The critical race theory movement is a collection of activists and scholars engaged in studying and transforming the relationship among race, racism, and power. That's a very high level definition. We're going to unpack that in the next 20 minutes or so. But I thought that the first question to ask concerns this meaning critical. Like, what makes a theory critical? And the idea here is that a critical theory is drawing on new insights that in times past had not been taken into consideration. But more specifically, those who say or espouse critical theory would say that it has to have explanatory power. That is, it must explain what's wrong with our current social situation. Any proponent of critical theory must explain what's wrong with the world. And typically this entails identifying the powers that maintain what's wrong with our system, but it also has to be practical. It must be capable of identifying the key actors and policy changes necessary to change society. In particular, it does carry this activist dimension, which Delgado and Stefanczyk embrace. I'm quoting them now. It tries not only to understand our social situation, but to change it. And then finally, it's normative. The theory, for a theory to be critical, it must provide clear norms or standards for criticism and identify the practical goals that are achievable to enable social transformation. So it has to offer some foundation of the ideal state of the world from which judgments can be made about what is right and wrong. So finally, what are some of the basic tenets of critical race theory according to Delgado and Stefanczyk? And again, I am merely trying to summarize and state their arguments. We will offer some critique here near the end. Their first is that racism in the United States is the norm. Racism is not an aberration. It is not localized and entirely localized. It is not something that just flares up from time to time. It is the usual way society does business. It is the common everyday experience of most people of color in this country. And they point out some general statistics about the lives of people of color in the United States. For instance, Blacks and Latinos who seek loans, apartments, or jobs are much more apt to be denied when similarly qualified whites apply for the same things. They note that Black families on average command anywhere from 1/10 to 1/13 of the assets of their white counterparts. They note that the prison population is largely Black or brown. And these are, in their minds, big, large social realities that describe day-to-day life for people of color in the United States. So that's one of their first core claims. The second is that racism serves the interests of the dominant group. And these interests may be both psychic and material. That is, they may solve the consciences of white people, but they also provide material benefits. So doctrines like colorblindness or formal conceptions of equality, like we're all human beings, we're all God's creatures. These are typically expressed in rules that insist treatment is equal across the board. And these kinds of rules really only remedy the most blatant forms of discrimination, like mortgage redlining or, say, raiding a food processing plant to target Latino workers. The third point, race is fundamentally a social construct. CRT would argue that race really isn't rooted in biology or genes or genetics, but is ultimately products of thought and relations. Sure, people are from particular parts of the world, and they may have many physical and cultural characteristics in common, but underlying this is the humanity of all people. So race isn't inherent and fixed. Race does not correspond to a biological or a genetic reality. More cynically, they assert that races are categories that society invents, manipulates, or retires when it is convenient. And closely related to this is the idea of racialization. Critical writers in law and social science have examined how a dominant society might racialize a minority group at different times. And these examples hopefully will help us make sense of that term. It's a newer technical term. So for instance, at one period, society may have had little use for Blacks, like post-slavery, but a great need for Mexican or Japanese agricultural workers. The Japanese at one time in our history were greeted with intense disfavor and were once removed, right, to war relocation camps. And more recently, Muslims, while they may have been fun neighbors who cooked great food in the past, now they're increasingly viewed with suspicion as security and terror threats. So this is meant to depict a reinterpretation of people groups based on other events that are taking place in our culture. And the related theme here is intersectionality, which simply states that no person has a single, easily stated unitary identity. So, for instance, a white feminist may be also Jewish. A Black man might also be gay, and therefore both would face discrimination or might face discrimination on multiple fronts, not just for the color of their skin, but for their sexual orientation. Intersectionality is basically saying there are people who can experience multiple forms of discrimination from various sectors in our society based on these things. And I will quote right from them. The term is meant to acknowledge that everyone has potentially conflicting overlapping identities, loyalties, and allegiances. And so they will give one example of like the day-to-day life of a Black woman who is also a single mother. She might experience discrimination when a new supervisor assigns her disagreeable work because he doesn't like Black women. He might believe that they're lazy or unreliable. He might be thinking that they'd be better off at home. Can she sue on grounds of discrimination? Possibly, but what if the supervisor gets on well with Black men and plays basketball with them after work? Then it would be hard to show where racism over skin color would apply there. Well, then they say, well, how about suing on grounds of sexual discrimination? But then they point out the supervisor may very well have good relationships with other white women at work. So this might be something that would never hold up in court. Keep in mind, because critical race theory is focused quite heavily on law, many of their examples are along these lines. This is what intersectionality means for those in the critical race theory camp. Okay, a couple more, and then we'll look at some hallmark themes, and I don't have a time on my, okay, just checking that. So that's intersectionality and racialization. A fourth point, I find this interesting. They point out that voices of color are in a unique position to inform whites on racism. Here, thinkers point out that Black, American Indian, Asian, and Latino writers and thinkers are able to communicate their perspectives on race that whites are probably unlikely to know or understand or actually be aware of. In other words, they assert that the minority status of these people bring with it what they call a presumed competence to speak on matters of race and racism. And closely related to this are these themes of legal storytelling, which involve tapping into stories of persuasion in order to understand how Americans see race. So they look at a couple dominant narratives in our culture today. And the first narrative sees our society gradually becoming less racist through the racial tensions are abating with the end of slavery, the enactment of civil rights legislation, the increasing popularity of Black athletes and those in the media and Hollywood, and even the election of an African-American president, or a Barack Obama, a Black president. This narrative can see the gap between Blacks and whites closing. So it also would say we shouldn't go too far in providing benefits for Blacks, as it might induce dependency and a welfare mentality. It also usually carries with it this idea that most Americans are fair-minded individuals and harbor little racial prejudice. Yet you might hear other narratives told by Blacks or Chinese or Latinos or Japanese that involve infant death rates that are nearly double those of whites, that recall stories of being stopped and pulled over multiple times for a broken taillight, that include arrest and incarceration rates that are among the highest in the world. That also include school dropout rates among Blacks and Latinos that are worse than nearly any other industrialized area in the world. I'm sorry, in the country. And there's these wide life expectancy gaps that remain roughly the same between whites and people of color that remain largely unchanged from where they were 30 years ago. And then we see violence against Muslims and people who look like they're from the Middle East is on the rise. And also those who look like, those who look to be Asian. So there's two large competing narratives and in our culture, and CRT asks how do we account for this? And basically what CRT says is that it's experience, it's life experience that has a lot to do with it. So they would say that people of different races can have radically different experiences of life. And therefore they are urging others to tell their own or their counter narratives that challenge this idea that that it's easy or we should be colorblind, and that CRT is actually inciting hatred. This is again right out of critical race theory. Their argument is based on the prior point of race being a construct. They say if race is not real or objective but constructed, racism and prejudice should be capable of deconstruction. The pernicious beliefs and categories are, after all, our own. Powerfully written stories and narratives may begin a process of correction in our system of beliefs and categories by calling attention to neglected evidence and reminding readers of our common humanity. Something to think about. And then finally, this will be the last big tenet. They would say that racism is reflected in law. And here I should point out that the authors of this text don't actually list this as a distinctive. However, legal scholar Angela Harris, who wrote the foreword for this book, does point out that critical race theory treats law and policy as central, race as rather central to law and policy in the United States, and challenges the popular belief that eliminating racism is simply about getting rid of ignorance or encouraging everyone to just get along. So according to Harris and other proponents of CRT, racism is inherent in the structure of our legal institutions, and we'll explain this shortly, or give at least an example of where they see this. So those are the basic tenets. In the time that's left, I want to introduce a couple of other points that I've summarized under hallmark themes of CRT, and then we'll hopefully, I'll offer some criticisms and do so from a Christian perspective. So one of the hallmark themes is this notion of interest convergence in law. What that basically means is that, yeah, we have this civil rights legislation in our history that has made life better, but the enactment of this legislature as being motivated by altruism or empathy or concern over the plight of the marginalized, that has been challenged, and critical race theorists will assert and indeed argue that usually whites or those in power will have something to gain by the enactment of this legislature, which was taken as a ludicrous claim several years ago when Derek Bell wrote an article for the Harvard Review, where he challenged the notion that the U.S. Supreme Court suddenly realized the immorality of the separate but equal doctrine in Brown versus Board of Education. So he hypothesized that other domestic and international economic considerations rendered the Supreme Court more likely to stop fighting the NAACP and to finally enact this legislation. Um, in part, he said that it was more over United States international concern over their image worldwide, especially given that the U.S. was locked in a Cold War battle and competing for the loyalties of other nations, most which of were Black and brown. And so out of a desire to win favor internationally, the passing of this law became more tolerable. So this is what has since been labeled an instance of interest convergence, that it served whites and it served the United States government as well as serving Blacks. Again, this ignited firestorms of controversy. It was thought to be excessively cynical in his claims, but it is interesting, at least, to find subsequent archival research in the U.S. Department of State and Justice did uncover a flood of secret cables and internal memos that at least acknowledge that this may have been one of the reasons why this legislature was enacted. Again, it is somewhat revisionist, and that's a title that CRT proponents will embrace, to say, let's look at this, our record of battling race in the United States, and see if indeed it is as clean as some of us think. A second hallmark is a critique of liberalism, which I'll define, which is kind of interesting because a lot of evangelicals would tend to think that CRT is itself deeply liberal and therefore bankrupt. But what they're attacking here are these liberal ideals of individual human beings in the abstract. That is, individuals without historical and social contexts. So liberals will often argue that any form of race consciousness itself is racist. And they intend to interpret any kind of race conscious reform as a kind of deviation from this ideal of neutrality. So in their book, Delgado and Stefanczyk focus on the idea of colorblindness. They acknowledge, yes, it can be an admirable quality, for instance, when like a decision maker refuses to give in to local prejudice, but it can also be, in their words, perverse when it stands in the way of taking an account of difference in order to help people in need. So many CRT scholars are critical of certain Supreme Court opinions that hold that it is wrong to take any note of race. And they think in particular, this kind of colorblind legislation can only at best redress extreme racial harms that everyone would condemn anyway. So again, the core assumption here is that a subtle racism is embedded into our law processes and social structures that keep minorities in subordinate positions. Now, without a doubt, a strong activist dimension here is on display when Delgado and Stefanczyk assert, and I'm quoting, only aggressive, color-conscious efforts to change the way things are will do much to ameliorate misery. An example of this is some new theories that have been put forward by thinkers that ask that when we look to create legislation, we, I'm quoting, look to the bottom, like as look to the lowest of the low, those who are hurting, to see and ask how legislation might impact them, or perhaps even compound issues. So this is very much a legal challenge, taking on the idea of neutrality. So there's this critique of this liberal idea of neutrality. There's also a critique, or what I'm calling a hallmark feature of structural determinism. It asserts that our system, by reason of its structure and vocabulary, is ill-equipped to redress certain kinds of wrong. And they give two examples. The first would be what's known as the empathetic fallacy. It suggests that people are reasonable enough to change their opinions of someone if they're just given enough information. And this is a hot button issue. Hate speech is where they hone in. If a minority is on the receiving end of a stinging remark, the solution, many would say, is to punish the speaker. I'm sorry, is not to punish the speaker or to enact any kind of draconian hate speech legislation, but rather to urge the victim to speak back to the defender. And the mantra here is the cure for bad speech is more speech. But CRT critics like Delgado, Stefanchik call this thinking flawed, and they label it the empathetic fallacy. And it is this: the idea that one can use words to undo the meanings that others attach to these very same words is to commit the empathetic fallacy. The belief that one can change a narrative merely by offering another better one, that the reader's or listener's empathy will quickly and reliably take over. Unfortunately, the authors note, empathy and altruism is in short supply in our culture. So this might be something we could challenge or maybe agree with, or a little bit of both. Can appealing and enacting laws solve our racial woes? And they also point out, they offer a rejoinder to this notion that the cure for bad speech is more speech, and they point out, given our increasingly violent culture, that might actually be foolhardy, especially with the proliferation of guns. It may lead to violence. It may also be anonymous. This may have been enacted online. If certain forms of media hardly lend themselves to these kinds of informed conversations. Just go ahead for fun and say something controversial on Facebook, and then see if you can get somebody to respond to you, and then have an informed dialogue where you eventually come to an understanding. We know that just doesn't happen, at least on that media. And it's not just the media, it's the human heart behind it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Anyway, they're not terribly enthused by this notion of encouraging more speech. They also critique what's known as the black-white binary, which is, again, a subset of this structural determinism. What they point out is that this kind of binary thinking, it puts non-Black minority groups in a difficult position where they almost have to compare their treatment to, say, African Americans in order to have their own grievances at least redressed. So the problem with a black-white binary is that it effectively reduces race to mean African American, and it often covers up unique ways in which other minority groups might be discriminated against. For instance, they say Juan is a Puerto Rican worker, and he might be mocked for his accent or his religion or his place of birth, while African Americans are generally not discriminated against on those particular grounds. They might be discriminated against for other things, certainly, but usually not those. And they also note that there can be a Black exceptionalism that eclipses the particular needs of other marginalized people. Okay, I have a sinking feeling that none of this was very intelligible. But we'll find out. I know we have some questions. At the very least, I hope you have some vague notion of what critical race theory is. There may be some things that you would want to ask about critical race theory that weren't mentioned here, or some other terms that might be related to it. By all means, I'll do the best I can. But in the time that's left here, like 10 or 12 minutes before questions, I would like to try to say something. I'm going to critique CRT. This is my take with a little bit of help from an article or two on what I think we can say about this as Christians. So I think there are there are some deeply troubling things to me personally, but I want to start with things that I think are what I would call positives. And I'm starting with some high level praise. You've got to start somewhere. And the first one is I think CRT scholars ought to be condoned for recognizing that there is a problem with society and culture at large, and for wanting to do something about it. I think they're especially honest about our lack of both empathy and altruism in our culture, though as I will say shortly, I think they're still working with a deeply liberal view of humanity. I think CRT is honest about the sad history of racism in America, and can acknowledge that even legal gains may have come from other motives that are less than entirely pure. A second positive I see is that they're able to offer a slightly more nuanced perspective on the complexities of racism as experienced by the marginalized. They do bring in some terminology that may be useful in parsing out some of these complexities that attune us to the realities that those of us who are white or who are in a position where we don't experience racism, things that we may not be able to see. I'm going to just give one example of an article that was recently in Christianity Today. D.A. Horton is a professor of intercultural studies at California Baptist University. And he said critical race theory does provide language for concepts that believers, specifically of color, have wrestled with in their minds, and now they have terms to use to help these abstract ideas explain in concrete ways. He gives a couple of examples, and that's hot button language. He talks about microaggression and intersectionality. And again, this term microaggression, this, depending on the context in which you use that word, it can be an identifying label. So Horton, for instance, remembers riding in a car with his friend on the way to the airport. He was flying off to grad school to start to take his PhD exams. And he was told by a Christian friend who said, look, you don't need to stress out. You're going to pass no matter what. You're a minority and the school needs more Hispanics. This, I think, as an attempt to kind of cheer him up or to put his mind at ease. But the unintentional conclusion that Horton drew from this exchange suggested that he said in his mind that I didn't have the educational capacity to pass. And while he acknowledges he couldn't know all of his friend's motives, he said he found the language of microaggression actually helped him make sense of his experience. And then he also said, the language of intersectionality might help us actually when in instances when we're interpreting scripture, which again might raise some eyebrows. But he's thinking in particular of Jesus' dialogue with the Samaritan woman at the well. And biblical commentators will point out that she was there in the heat of the day, which is when you typically wouldn't be gathering water, in part because she was potentially ostracized or embarrassed to be seen by others. So here you have a woman of a particular race. She's a Samaritan, and she's a woman, and she's had several husbands. So there are several things working against her that show that she was probably in this context herself a victim of some type of racism. or discrimination. Granted, there's other things going in the passage there. And I mean, I think that the biggest thing is that for Jesus, that was hardly a problem to speak to her. Scandalous, yes, but not a problem. So those are a couple examples. You don't have to be convinced by those. I wanted to let Horton have his own voice. A third thing I see that's positive is that critical race theory rightly recognizes the power of story in its attempt to give a voice to the marginalized. So it recognizes that insights from narrative theory and that stories themselves have the power to shape they're thinking primarily in the legal realm. Remember, they're also the group that works against or rejects this notion the cure for bad speech is more speech. And here they're challenging law and the supposed neutrality of law. A couple more things of points of agreement before I wrap up with some criticisms. CRT acknowledges that race is a social category. Look, we don't deny gender. Why do we deny color? Shouldn't people be seen in all their particularity while at the same time recognizing that they're human beings made in God's image? So this view rightly asserts that science can't demonstrate, is unable to demonstrate, and social characteristics or cultural forms are not just merely biologically programmed. And then finally, I'll move on from that, and you can ask questions if you're so inclined. I found this idea of looking to the bottom in terms of law, and again, I have almost no legal training, and so I can't speak as a lawyer to the feasibility of these challenges, but I couldn't help but think that this notion of looking to the bottom, I couldn't help but think of passages in the Old Testament that call for caring for or enacting certain kinds of behaviors that care for the marginalized, the foreigners, the widows, and the aliens among you. And this is all throughout the Pentateuch, Exodus 22, Leviticus 19. It's all over Deuteronomy. So I think that's an intriguing notion. And I think as Christians, that might be something that, in certain circumstances, we could get behind. But there are definitely bigger issues at stake here. And so, and there, I think from my perspective, there's also some significant areas of disagreement. And these honestly are coming from a Christian worldview which ultimately, while recognizing evil in its many forms, sees reconciliation in Christ as determinative for our relationships with each other and the world. And so I think here I'm drawing on Carl Trueman, an article he wrote in First Things earlier this year. He points out that critical race doctrine seems to be, in a sense, almost self-certifying. And that some of the claims about systematic inequalities might be a bit axiomatic. I mean, he's not denying that there may be systemic racism out there, but he points out some of the Marxist strands that are still present in contemporary critical race theory. Which would insist that the oppressors so control society that the oppressed actually believe that their own interests are being served by keeping the status quo. So that if anyone dares to defend the status quo, it merely shows how dominated you are. So it effectively shuts down any kind of real conversation. But more importantly, I think critical race theory is morally thin, or maybe a better term would be morally flat. And by that, I mean several things. Here's the first one. I think critical race theory is probably too focused on the systemic to the exclusion of the personal. Yes, there are social structures in place that we could call systematically discriminatory, like the prison system and some of the legislature behind it. Getting tough on drugs, which is a whole nother story and a whole nother lecture that might actually be way more interesting than this one. I think that I don't think we need to question the fact that there are systemic structures that help fuel racism and discrimination. But at the same time, there is a much deeper fault line that runs, right through the human heart. And here I'm taking the quote from Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who said, the line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart. Even in the best of all hearts, there remains an uprooted small corner of evil. And there are indeed degrees of evil and multiple causes, but critical race theory seems to focus very narrowly on the systemic. And here I am borrowing on Carl Trueman's from earlier this year. He points out that critical theories define central injustices as systematic. This means that everyone is complicit, even if no one in particular is responsible. The system is immoral, and individual agents and acts reflect the evils of the system. And by talking all the time about systemic racism, we undermine our ability to distinguish among degrees of evil, which is necessary not in order to excuse evil acts, but to rank them on a moral scale. And if indeed CRT is too focused on the systemic, I think that their proposed solution is, again, focusing on laws is also to the exclusion of other means, is reductionistic, and it almost reduces things to a kind of zero-sum game where you have winners and losers. And if indeed, and I do think we have winners and losers in our society today, CRT is effectively saying we have the power to enact better legislation that will, in theory, create a more just and democratic society. But I think we could also label that vision as just rearranging the oppressor and the oppressed, focusing on the winners and the losers. And that here, I think this comes off as mildly utopian, maybe. There seems to be this kind of blind hope that a more just society will bring an end to the need for future legislative reforms. We might, on other grounds, say that there will always be winners and losers before Christ comes again. And we could tie that to a two kingdoms doctrine. And I am, as I'm wrapping this up, I am getting an acute sense that we need a lot more theology here than I have time for. Something else I found interesting, this made it just left a bad taste in my mouth. And again, I shouldn't perhaps expect this from a secular theory, but I didn't find any room for these deeper themes like reconciliation or forgiveness or love. Indeed, Christians who preach these things may very well be perceived as part of the problem. In fact, insofar as a neo-Marxist or a Frankfurt School of Cultural Analysis view of religion would see it as just one other way to placate the masses and to allow systems of oppression to remain in place. Another problem, I think CRT actually shuts down conversation. And I think this is especially visible in their criticism of answering hate speech with more speech. I mean, no doubt we have to be careful here. And they do raise valid points given our increasingly violent society. But while we can say that all hate speech is sinful, enacting rigorous hate speech legislation, I think legally will always continue to bump up against the First Amendment. And more tragically, I think it just shuts down meaningful dialogue. And the deep irony here is that the dialogue is being shut down in places that are dedicated to learning. I'm thinking of our universities and our higher institutions of learning, and it ends up coming off as somewhat draconian. Anyway, I'll stop there because I know we're running out of time, and you've probably got a lot of questions that I won't be able to answer. And then finally, CRT embraces I think, an unacceptably liberal understanding of humanity. While they criticize the liberal perspective of colorblindness, by this I mean in a more theological sense, and inattention to the doctrine of sin and original sin. Yes, CRT can recognize a lack of empathy and altruism in the world, but a liberal understanding of humanity implies that with enough hard work and goodwill and intelligence, we'll be able to overcome any problems we face. And I think that's unrealistic, given what we know about our sinful condition. So I've got my own set of concluding questions that I haven't answered, and I think where more work needs to be done. I'm curious about what the underlying notions of justice are that drive critical race theory. I think there's more work to be done on the anthropology behind what it means to be a human being. I think there are huge questions about how Christians confront discrimination and oppression. And again, that could be its own talk. How do Christians, for instance, as members of two kingdoms at once, right? Earthly kingdoms and the kingdom of God, how do we stand up for the oppressed and marginalized, which is certainly a biblical theme? What does the gospel have to say in all of this? Again, I keep coming back to the absence of love in this theory. And if indeed love is the most transformative power in the universe, God is love, it's not just an abstract power. What does love say in all of it? And I can't resist also, this is the last thing I promise, tapping into this idea, and I think this good idea they have is of counter narratives, giving the marginalized time and opportunity to tell their stories. Like, well, as Christians, why don't we take as a white Christian, why don't I take a part in asking people of color, if they have time, to tell me what life is like for them in the United States? Knowing also that as Christians, we do have a better narrative. We have the best narrative of all because it's true, and it rests on the transcendent power of God who came to dwell among his people in Jesus Christ. Last statement, and then I know there's probably a bajillion questions here. Returning back to this two kingdoms thinking that goes, all the way back to Augustine and was taken up by Martin Luther. I guess I think that there is room for Christians to embrace certain aspects of CRT without holding back on areas where we would be critical. And I've listed some of them there. And again, given that we are simultaneously members of two kingdoms, the earthly kingdom of America and the kingdom of God, and they are not the same. Given that we are simultaneously members of both, we are called and are in a unique position to defend the oppressed and the marginalized, but yet without having to place all of our trust in these earthly kingdoms, much less be burdened with the responsibility of ensuring that history turns out right. But we also have moral individual responsibility. It's more than just structural. But I need to drink something, and I'll settle for water, and I'll stop sharing.